interaction between hosts and pathogens, infectious microorganisms, are very complex. And at the moment, that complexity challenges us as scientists and you as farmers in how we deal with some of these infectious organisms. Intervention mechanisms are being developed, ways to control disease or maybe even treat disease, but I think that they're quite a few years away. And unfortunately, what you really want as farmers is you want something that's broad spectrum and that will tackle a large number of infectious microorganisms. And most of the treatments we have currently just work on a single disease-causing organism. So in reality, they're perhaps not that useful. And we know well, and you know well, about the problems of emerging diseases. So we have examples of new diseases that have been identified moving into India, new bacterial infections that are moving through Asia, although perhaps not in India already. And we also know that quite often the shrimp that you grow are infected with multiple organisms, so it's not just a single infection. And again, this presents a challenge to treatment. To mention briefly climate change, it's not something that we can ignore. And as we look to the future, I think we need to expect that we're going to see more problems as the climate changes and as new diseases appear and new diseases move around the world. So, in the short term, where does this leave us? And I think, at least from my perspective, we need to move away from this view that we can actually remove disease, we can control disease, we can eradicate disease. I think in the future, we need to move towards the concept of just maximising crop health. So doing all that you can to ensure the health of your crop against all of the challenges that they face during production. So this cartoon at the bottom just shows the interaction between the disease-causing organism, the pathogen, the host, i.e. the shrimp that you're growing, and the environment in which both of those organisms exist. And in the centre, at the intersection, is where you have your opportunity for disease. So we need to appreciate the importance of the environment in controlling disease and controlling infection within the pond. We have experimental evidence for this from laboratory studies. So the details of this figure don't really matter, but this shows Chinese shrimp infected with white spot syndrome virus, the virus that you have in India. And this figure shows the influence of temperature on disease progression. So we have a graph showing shrimp mortality over time, and at low temperatures, shrimp mortality is slowed. It's not stopped, but it's slowed. So we know from the studies like this and other studies indicated there that temperature has an effect on the rate of mortality after white spot syndrome virus infection. From a similar study, we also know that salinity exerts a control on the rate of mortality from white spot syndrome virus infection. Again, the detail of this figure doesn't matter, but a similar thing, we have cumulative mortality, or the rate of mortality, if you like, after infection over time. And here again, at 20 parts per thousand, a lower salinity, the rate of mortality is reduced. So here again we have evidence that at low salinity, the rate of mortality from white spot is slowed. So this again makes the point that we should be aware of the environment when we're thinking about how infectious microorganisms might affect the shrimp in our pond. Oxygen is another key environmental parameter that many of you will appreciate the importance of. And again, just some other experimental examples. These are all laboratory experiments showing the effect of density and consequently oxygen concentration on the rate of mortality in response to bacterial infection and virus infection. And again, the details of these figures don't matter, but the point that they make is that high-density farming, high-density shrimp, show increased mortality after infection with either bacteria or virus. Shrimp that are held at low density have a low rate of mortality or lower rate of mortality following infection with with bacteria or virus. So we know that temperature, we know that salinity, and we know that oxygen are important controls on the rate at which mortality might occur in a pond. Now, I know you're sitting there and many of you will be thinking, well, these are just lab studies, and I work in a farm, I work in a real world, and that's a much, much more complicated environment with many factors interacting at the same time. So this is just another study which begins to show that point. If we start putting different environmental factors together, we have different effects on the rate of mortality. So these are white shrimp fed infected meat, infected with IMNV. And up the side we have the proportion of infected animals after they've been fed infected meat. So at the far end, FIT shows the proportion of infected animals after just straightforward feeding with infected meat. The next one along, FITA, proportion of infected animals after feeding, suffering alkalinity stress. So these shrimp were subject to alkalinity stress. If we go right to the end, FITS, this shows us the proportion of infected animals that were fed infected meat and suffering temperature stress. In the middle here, FITES, we put temperature and salinity stress together, and interestingly, we see the proportion of infected animals drops. So there's a complex interaction between these different environmental parameters that make managing disease in a pond complicated, and we need to understand the interaction of the environment and how this might affect disease outcome. And a better understanding of these factors will help us to minimize or reduce the rate of disease outcome in the farm. Now, I know that your farms, your ponds, they are very, very complicated environments. In your ponds, some conditions within the pond change relatively slowly during your days of culture. So this is data collected by SEBA during our current project, working with real shrimp farmers, working in shrimp farming ponds. So on this first panel here, we have how dissolved oxygen changes in a pond during days of culture. And in general, there's a decline in the oxygen concentration in the pond during days of culture. Similarly, over on the far side, we have data on ammonia accumulation, ammonia concentration in the pond. And in general, during your days of culture, the concentration of ammonia starts to increase. So we have certain conditions that change fairly uniformly during pond conditions. But equally, we have other conditions, other environmental conditions in the pond that change rather erratically, and you will know this yourselves already. So this top panel up here shows us how bacterial counts might change within a pond during days of culture. And although the colours haven't come out very well, the data is very erratic, so the bacterial population in the pond is changing quite erratically. This panel down here shows how temperature changes within a pond during days of culture. Obviously, temperature will be influenced by the local weather conditions, and again, we see rather erratic changes in temperature during the pond culture conditions. And the same for salinity over there. Salinity during days of culture, again, rather erratic. So these are really complicated pond environments. And as scientists, I'm very aware that we should not underestimate the complexity of your pond environments. And whatever we do in terms of experiments or studies, we need to make sure that we are conscious and aware of the complexity of the environments in which you work and how that influences what we understand from our studies. But through a large number of studies, we can bring out general ideas and general principles about what's important and what is not important when we think about disease outbreaks. So in the top panel here, in green, we've summarised from a large number of published studies and from our own work with farmers, general principles which result in a low risk of disease outcome. So this shows just for temperature, but it could apply for other indices as well, that conditions of constant temperature reduce the risk of disease outcome. Conditions where you see a gradual change in temperature during your days of culture, again, have a low risk of disease outcome. Conditions where you have daily fluctuations in temperature, but over a very small temperature range, so the suggestion here is 4 degrees C, again, carry a low risk of disease outcome. Or where there's a low number of changes in temperature through the day, so the suggestion of 2 or 3 temperature fluctuations in a day, again, carry a low risk of disease outcome. In the bottom panel shown in red, contrast this with conditions that we can see increase the risk of disease outcome. So where you have a very low temperature or a very high temperature, so extremes of temperature during days of culture, increases your risk of a disease outcome. Where you have a rapid change in temperature in the middle of a culture cycle, that's stressful for your crop, and that precipitates or increases your risk of having an infectious outbreak. And the N2 panels, where we have very large fluctuations in daily temperature, that again causes stress for your shrimp and reduces the health of your shrimp and makes them more liable to infection. Or days where you have lots of fluctuations in temperature. So perhaps during the monsoon season or during the winter crop, where temperature, salinity is changing quite rapidly through the course of a growing cycle, that makes it a very stressful environment for your shrimp. And they're more likely to succumb to the infectious organisms that are in the pond water and that are very difficult to remove or control. So these are general principles that we can bring out from looking at large numbers of studies in the laboratory and the available field studies from scientists working with farmers like yourselves. We can begin to understand that actually variability in the pond, how quickly the pond conditions change, has really important control over how often you might see disease outbreaks in your pond. And I'll be honest, these aren't necessarily new ideas, and I know that some of you will be sitting in the audience going, well, we know this. You're here, you're interested in farm quality, in crop quality, so I'm talking to a group of engaged farmers that are already aware of all of these problems. And, you know, within India, you are very well organised. You have agencies such as NFDB and ICAR-SIBA who are there to support you in what you do. And as such, across Asia, you know, India is setting, if you like, a role model of how the government can work with farmers to help you in what you do. And they produce documents like this, best management practice or better management practice, which when followed, really do help and make a difference to how successful you are with every crop you grow. And we know from work that we've done in our current project that although these require you to do things to your pond during culture, require you to prepare your pond before culture, following these practical advice, this better management practice, will reduce the incidence of disease that you see and will help to improve the output from your ponds. And I should say that many other agencies, NACSA is another one that produce better management practice. This isn't the only document that's out there, there are lots of others. And we have evidence of this, so again, this is from our current work with Dr. Sahul Hamid from Vellore, from his lab, working with farmers as part of our project, going out to the farms, talking to farmers, finding out their experiences of disease, their growing practices, how they grow crops, how they prepare their ponds, how they look after pond quality. So lots of consultation, lots of talking to farmers, getting the farmers to come into the lab and to see what we do to understand infection and what we can do to help them with looking at PL quality and crop quality and diagnosis of disease. And then from that interaction, identifying engaged farmers that wanted to work with us and use the best available advice in growing their crops. And at the bottom here we have summary from a group of farmers in Nellore. Crop number 1 was when we just watched what they did and we let them grow their crop in their normal way. And then crops 2 and 3, they actually worked with us, with Dr. Suhail Hamid and his colleagues, to really follow the best available advice, really strictly, really rigorously, took every care and attention over the growth of that crop. And the main thing I want to draw your attention to is the increase in production, the figures in red from these crops. These were the highest production from these ponds that they'd ever witnessed, and also no disease outbreaks. This just represents 2 crop cycles. They've since had similar success with a 3rd crop cycle, and this adoption of these best available advice is now, by word of mouth, is moving out across that village of farmers. So for me, this is real evidence that if you follow the best advice, whilst it does not guarantee that you will not see disease, it very much helps you produce high quality, high value, high production crops with minimal or reduced incidences of disease, without the application of antibiotics, and with a reduction in the amount of chemical additions or chemical treatments that you're adding to your pond. So all again, at the end of the day, thinking back to how this helps us with the value chain, with accreditation, with producing healthy crops that we can export to the Western European consumer or these new markets that you want to break into. But how do we get this message of better management practice out to farmers? And so as part of the work that SEBA have done with other institutes, they've produced a phone app, this Vaname Shrimp app, which can be downloaded onto your mobile phone. And I know perhaps many of you already downloaded this. So far this has been downloaded over 10,000 times globally. And this provides farmers at the pond side with smartphone technology information on how to prepare their pond, how to stock their pond, how to grow their crop. Information that you perhaps already know, but it's there to have to hand at the pond side. And it has apps such as Pond Calculator to help work out pond additions, how much of a particular feed or particular treatment you should add to your pond. So as part of the work we've done in the project, we've translated this into Bengali so that this kind of technology, this kind of approach can be used in countries such as Bangladesh, but also West Bengal, and hopefully to broaden the uptake of this kind of technology to really help farmers at the pond side, because we understand that not every farmer can come to events like this. Not every farmer can come to formal arranged training events. Your time is very precious. So if we can get the information to you at the pond side, that has to be more useful. So if you haven't downloaded these already, I would really urge you to download the one that is most useful to you. And it will, I hope, help you in the work that you do growing successful crops. So we launched the Bengali version Chingri app in April this year in an event in Bangladesh, and that's already been downloaded over 500 times by farmers in Bangladesh, and we hope that that will help them develop a better farming system. And then, as we continue the work of the project, and as we heard yesterday, quite a lot of discussion and commentary about the need to diversify crops across the world, not just within India, but across the world. You already grow a range of species in India. You grow Macrobachium, there's some interest in Indicus, but predominantly in India now it's Vaname. And Vaname is the dominant species globally. And I would suggest to you that into the future, we should be very concerned that the global shrimp industry is concentrating on one species. This has lots and lots of problems associated with a reduction in genetic diversity, a reduction in quality of the brood stocks, which I know that some of you already are witnessing. Brood stock quality is going down of Vaname. It leaves us very exposed to the risk of infection. So if you get say, a new disease occurring in Vietnam. Because there's lots of anime everywhere, it can spread very quickly through different countries. We grow all these other organisms to varying degrees, macrobrachium, the freshwater prawn, and other shrimp and crabs as well. And we know from work that we've done in this current project that some of these species have a greater resistance to infection with different diseases. So in the future, to reduce the risk of disease and to increase the genetic diversity of the crops that we grow, I think we need to think about moving towards a more balanced culture, a more diverse culture where we increase the growth of species like macrobrachium and other species of crabs and other species of shrimp. And there are definitely problems with this. All of these species have their own problems that we have to work out. But if the drive to diversify crustacean culture is there from the farmers and from the consumers, then there's motivation for scientists to help you answer some of these problems about how we work with these species to maximize production, to maximize markets, to maximize the value chain. So as we think about the future, I would urge you all to think about the importance of the environment and how the environment influences your crop. I would urge you all, if not already, to follow the best or better management practice, the best available advice out there. And I would urge you all to think about crop diversity. How important is that to you, and how important is that to your region and to your country? And do you think that we need to diversify the crop? Are we running into problems with Vaname that we can't solve? Do we need to think about what else is out there that we should think about? And what help do you need from us as scientists to get these species to market and to the consumers, and to get consumer acceptance for some of these species? And we're hoping to explore this with workshops that we'll run throughout Asia, but starting in Bangladesh in 2020, 2021, and we'd welcome engagement with these conversations as we take them forward. So just to conclude, I haven't talked about crustacean immune function or in any detail about how crustacean immune system interacts with pathogens, but I can assure you that in the past decade, through work done by colleagues in India and in Thailand and in Vietnam and in China and in the UK and the rest of the world, our understanding of how these pathogens interact with the host immune system, the crustacean immune system, has advanced dramatically. We know so much more now than we did before. But if anything, what we know is that these interactions are even more complex than we perhaps first thought. And that leaves us with the realization that with your complicated pond environments, we're not going to be able to control or eradicate these diseases in the short term. Maybe in the long term, but in the next few years, my personal view is that we're not going to be in a position to eradicate some of these diseases in the pond environment. However, I think we can do an awful lot by thinking about the environmental regulation in our pond and what we can do to minimize the stress in our crop, to maximize crop health. So I think we need to farm for crop health rather than for disease eradication and disease removal. So I would strongly advocate, and I know many of you are doing this already, but I would strongly advocate the further uptake of better management practice and the really, if you like, rigorous adherence, rigorous following of better management practice. Because I think this is fundamentally important to your success in the short-term future. And I think through operating with the best available advice, you can reduce your reliance on products that you need to put into your pond. You can perhaps reduce down to zero the use of antibiotics, if at all they're being used anywhere in the culture system. And through that mechanism, you can start to think about certification, as 60 plus farms in this country already have done, at least with ASC. And I think through certification, that will open export markets, which I know that you're all very keen to develop. So I would encourage this way of thinking as a route towards opening up those export markets and growing the value of the shrimp industry within India. So I'll end there. Thank you.